Today is a busy day, as we all know. A very important vote is going to be taking place, and Republicans, Democrats will be meeting in their caucuses, so people are going to be coming in and out. I also think that this hearing is important enough that we extend the time for questioning from the usual 5 minutes to 7 minutes, if that's okay with folks. Let me begin by welcoming the CEOs of Bristol Myers Squibb, Chris Berner, we thank you for being here. CEO of Merck, Robert Davis, we thank you for being here. And the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, Joaquin Duato, for being with us this morning. Thanks very much. There is a lot of discussion in our nation about how divided our people are on many issues, and that is absolutely true. But on one of the most important issues facing our country, the American people, whether the Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Conservative, Progressive, could not be more united. And that is the need to substantially lower the outrageous price of prescription drugs in this country. According to a recent poll, 82% of Americans say the cost of prescription drugs is too high, and 73% say that the government is not doing enough to regulate drug prices. As a nation, we spend almost twice as much per capita on health care as do the people of any other country, $13,000 for every man, woman, and child. And one of the reasons that we spend so much is the high cost of prescription drugs in our country. The outrageous cost of prescription drugs in America means that 1 out of 4 of our people go to the doctor, get a prescription, and they cannot afford to fill that prescription. How many die as a result of that? How many suffer unnecessarily? Nobody knows. But my guess is it is in the millions, and I have talked to many of them in Vermont and around the country. Meanwhile, our insurance premiums are much higher than they should be, and hospital costs are soaring because of the high cost of prescription drugs. Further, the cost of prescription drugs in this country is putting an enormous burden on taxpayers and seniors by raising the cost of Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare alone spends at least $135 billion a year on prescription drugs. So this is not only a personal issue, it is an issue of the federal budget. Meanwhile, as we pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, 10 of the top pharmaceutical companies in America made over $110 billion in profits in 2022. They are doing phenomenally well, while Americans cannot afford the cost of the medicine they need, and the CEOs in general receive exorbitant compensation packages. This morning, we're going to hear a lot from our CEO panelists about how high prices are not their fault and that the PBMs are forcing Americans to pay much higher prices than they should be paying. But let us be clear. In 2022, Johnson & Johnson made nearly $18 billion in profit, paid its CEO over $27 million in compensation, and spent over $17 billion on stock buybacks and dividends. That same year, Merck made $14.5 billion in profits, handed out over $7 billion in dividends to their stockholders, and paid its CEO over $52 million in compensation. And Bristol Myers Squibb made $8 billion in profits last year, while recently spending over $12 billion on stock buybacks and dividends, and giving its CEO over $41 million in compensation. Now, why did a majority of members of this committee invite these 3 pharmaceutical CEOs to testify today? And the answer is pretty simple. Mr. Berner, we will want you to explain to the American people why Bristol Myers Squibb charges patients in our country $7,100 a year for Eliquis, when that same exact product can be purchased for just $900 in Canada and $650 in France. Mr. Duato, we're going to ask you why Johnson & Johnson charges Americans with arthritis $79,000 for Stelara, when that same exact product can be purchased for just $20,000 in Canada and just $12,000 in France. Mr. Davis, please tell us later why Merck charges Americans with cancer $191,000 a year for Keytruda, when that same product can be purchased for $112,000 in Canada and $91,000 in France. And let's be clear, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, and Bristol-Myers Squibb are not just charging higher prices in the United States compared to other countries. They are also charging Americans much higher prices today than they did in the past, even accounting for inflation. From 2004 to 2008, the median price of innovative new drugs sold by these three companies was just $14,000, inflation accounted. From 2019 to 2023, where we are today, the median price of new drugs sold by these three companies was $238,000. In other words, Americans are forced to pay higher and higher prices for the drugs they need to survive. And let's be clear, the overwhelming beneficiary of these high drug prices is the pharmaceutical industry. How do we know that? Well, that is precisely what they tell their investors. According to their own shareholder reports, Bristol-Myers Squibb made $34 billion selling the blood thinner Eliquis in the United States, compared to just $22 billion in the rest of the world combined. Make their money in the United States. In other words, the U.S. accounts for nearly two-thirds of all global sales of Eliquis. Not a single dollar of this revenue is going to PBMs. 100% of it is going to Bristol-Myers Squibb. Johnson & Johnson has reported to its shareholders that it made over $30 billion in revenue selling the arthritis drug Stelara in the United States since 2016, more than twice as much as the rest of the world combined. Nothing to do with PBMs. Merck has reported to its shareholders that it made $43.4 billion selling the cancer drug Keytruda in the United States, compared to $30 billion in the rest of the world combined. Now, our CEO panelists from the drug companies will tell us this morning how much it costs to develop new drugs and how often the research that they undertake for new cures is not successful. And they are right. We appreciate that. But what they have not told us in their written testimony is that 14 major pharmaceutical companies, including Johnson & Johnson and Merck, spent $87 billion more on stock buybacks and dividends over a recent 10-year period than what they spent on research and development. More on stock buybacks and dividends than in research and development. In fact, Bristol-Myers Squibb spent $3.2 billion more on stock buybacks and dividends in 2022 than it spent on research and development. Johnson & Johnson spent $46 billion more on stock buybacks and dividends than it spent on research and development since 2012. In other words, these companies are spending more to enrich their own stockholders and CEOs than they are in finding new cures and new treatments. Now, the average American who hears all of this is asking a very simple question. How does all of this happen? What's going on? How could drug companies charge us, in some cases, 10 times more than they charge Canadians or people around the world for the same drug? How do they get away with this when so many of our people cannot afford the high price of the drugs that they need? How can it be, uniquely among industrialized countries, that these companies, not just these companies, but the pharmaceutical industry in general, can raise prices anytime they want, to any level they want? Want to raise double prices? Do it any way they want. How do they get away with all of that? And here, in my view, is the answer. The United States government does not regulate drug companies. With very few exceptions, the drug companies regulate the United States government. That is the sad state of affairs in a corrupt political system. Over the past 25 years, the pharmaceutical industry, not just these companies, the entire industry, spent over $8.5 billion on lobbying and more than $745 million on campaign contributions. And let me be fair here. Don't want to misspeak. They are bipartisan. They give to Republicans, they give to Democrats. And I am especially impressed by the Pfizer drug company. Pfizer is not here this morning, contributing $1 million to the Republican Party in Kentucky to expand its headquarters, named after Republican leader Mitch McConnell. But again, it's not just Republicans, it's Democrats as well. Unbelievable. This is an astounding fact. Last year, drug companies had over 1,800 well-paid lobbyists here in D.C. to make sure that Congress did their bidding. There are 535 members of Congress and 1,800 well-paid lobbyists, over 3 for every member of Congress. So if you want to know why you're paying the highest prices in the world, America, that's why. Now, here is some good news in the midst of all that. We are beginning to take on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry. As a result of the Inflation Reduction Act passed several years ago, Medicare, for the first time ever, is beginning to do what every major country on earth does and what the Veterans Administration has been doing for over 30 years, and that is to negotiate the lower prices of drugs, including Januvia, Stelara, and Eliquis. Let me conclude by saying this. I am proud of what this committee up to this point has accomplished. Last year, as you'll all remember, the CEO of Moderna committed during a Health Committee hearing that his company would make certain that no one in America would have to pay for their vaccine out of pocket. We appreciated that. In a separate Health Committee hearing last May, the CEO of Eli Lilly committed that his company would not raise prices on existing insulin products after having, in fact, lowered them. But let's be clear, much more needs to be done. I look forward to hearing from our CEO panelists this morning as to how they are going to go forward to substantially lower the cost of prescription drugs in this country.